It's 2007, 1 year before the Beijing Olympic Games. Germany's Matthias Steiner is deep into his weightlifting training, and one day he gets a call that his wife had been killed in a fatal car crash. Quote, I had to make a decision to stop or carry on with weightlifting. I realized that if I stopped, what had happened was not going to change. So he continued training, and eventually the day for him to compete did roll around. Quote, a lot of other guys listen to music. I intentionally don't. I leave it at home because I want to feel the atmosphere. In the arena, there's a certain hum of excitement that comes from the crowd. You go to weigh in and all the athletes are sitting around staring at each other. You sit down and there are loads of these big bears who are looking at you. And they do look very pumped, but I've always thought to myself, you're nervous inside too. He snatched 198 as his opener, and he went to hit 203 in a second attempt. And did. He was successful in that, and that was actually a personal best for him. And then he went for 210 kilograms, which would have been a big personal best, and also would have really probably put him in medal contention. And that was sort of the thought process behind that. And he missed his third attempt. And that sort of took the wind out of his sails, and really he kind of felt like he would never, sort of fulfill that oath that he made to himself after the passing of his wife to perform in this way and be able to get on the podium. And when he went back to warm up for his clean and jerks, he actually missed 235 in the back warm up area. And his coach came up to him and was like, hey, we got to open with 246. So he went out, missed 246 on his first attempt for clean and jerks. And again, he was just kind of feeling down on himself. It just felt like he didn't have any energy and just didn't have what it took. And his coach came back and was like, hey, if you can make 246, you're going to be able to get on the podium. And this really changed his mindset. And in the second attempt, he went out and successfully lifted that 246 kilograms. Quote, a weight was lifted from my shoulders. I'd have bronze at the Olympic Games no matter what. To clinch the gold, it was going to take a massive 258 kilograms. Quote, I didn't have to wait for anyone else to fail their attempts. In life, you have two or three, maybe only one chance. You have to grab it. That's the difference between a very good athlete and a champion. Matthias made the lift in emotional fashion, and that evening when he was on the podium, standing at the very top, getting his gold medal, he held a photograph of his wife. Competing is so different from training. In training, it's calculated, it's controlled, it's rhythmic in a sense, where you're going through your warm-up in a particular way. You go through your sets and your reps, and it's a very similar outline. And so many times I've had athletes who have very good training progressions, and they have the capacity, they have what it takes, and then when they go out to compete, they fall short. They lack what Matthias had, the art of competing. Hey, it's Ben Wise, and this is the Fitness Movement. The Fitness Movement is brought to you by Zor Fitness. Zor Fitness is my company and my platform to deliver training content to coaches and athletes like you. The site has educational resources on everything from program design and exercise physiology to skill progressions and movement breakdowns. And in terms of programming, we have our online training program, The Protocol, and I also offer one-on-one remote coaching. It's all at one place, zorfitness.com. And welcome back to my rant on the art of competing. The outline of today's show. First thing I want to talk about is what I'm calling the pyramid of performance. So basically, the art of competing is at the very top. It's the point of the pyramid. I want to go over what things are supporting that kind of tip of the spear, right? So the things that are the underlying underpinnings that are going to allow for expression of your top performance when you actually go out to compete. And then I want to give you 5 ways of how you can embrace your inner competitor. This is number 1, reinterpret arousal. 2, reframe fatigue. 3, stay composed. 4, race tactics. 5, head games. But first, before we actually dive into all of those, I want to read an excerpt from the ebook that I wrote, Breathwork for the Sport of Fitness. The painter versus the artist. Skill is a prerequisite to art. First, there is the painter. He spends his time putting lines, shapes, and shades on a canvas. He's talented at what he does. His skills set him apart. People admire his perfectly straight lines, beautiful shapes, and his unique palette of perfectly blended colors. Yet, he is not an artist, and he has not created art. He has the skill, but lacks the vision, direction, purpose, and intent. Then there is the artist. He also spends his time putting lines, shapes, and shades on a canvas. However, he doesn't think about what he does as lines, shapes, or shades. He doesn't think about his techniques. Rather, he directs his attention, his focus on the overarching themes and feelings he longs to create. He is invested so deeply in his fundamental skills that the focus moves vertically to create something bigger and broader. The focus moves from painting to creating art. So to sum it up, you can't create art unless you've done the necessary preparation. So unless you've invested so deeply in your tier 1 skills, in this case it was like painting lines and strokes and blending colors, unless you can do that stuff, in this case it might be being able to do ring muscle ups and touch and go snatches and burpee box jump overs, unless you don't have to think about those things when you're in the middle of doing those things and maintain the technique, you'll never be able to create art when you go to compete. So that being said, you always are going to be kind of stuck in this immediate focus, right sort of in the moment in what you're actually doing. And you're never going to be able to sort of take a step back and be able to kind of visualize or to be able to take a wider picture of what's going on around you, which is definitely a necessary thing. If you're in an in-person competition and you want to be able to perform at your best, you have to be able to take in what's around you and process that while being able to still continue in the performance that you're currently doing in yourself and not get pulled away from that in terms of your focus as well. So it's a very delicate balance that we're talking about here. What I would ask yourself, where does the art of competing fit into the bigger picture of competitive fitness? I could maybe ask it a different way. How do higher order skills fit into the total picture of an athlete's competitive results? The way I went about answering this is with the pyramid of performance. So, as I mentioned before, the top of the pyramid, the peak, is the art of competing. I'm calling that execution, right? It's your ability to be able to execute on game day. There's 2 layers below that. Let's go to the base of the pyramid first. The base of the pyramid is capacity. So capacity is those underlying physiological systems that are going to support higher level performance. So these are things like, again, the 2 things that people normally think of when they think of a base, right? Like an aerobic base. Totally true. Like that would totally fit in here. We could also say like a base of strength would fit in here. So I think those are the 2 that people often go to in their minds, but this involves other physiological underpinnings that are going to be necessary, again, to support that higher level performance. So it could be things like muscular endurance. It could be a person's ability to deal with high levels of volume, right? So being able to develop tissue tolerance. It could be mobility. So do you have the positions that are necessary, the sort of the prerequisites to be able to layer on higher order movements? So capacity is the baseline. That's the bottom of the pyramid. That's going to be always necessary for you to keep coming back to and keep widening that base to be able to support higher order performance on top of that. So capacity is the base of the pyramid. If we move up to the middle layer, this is economy. So economy, we could also maybe refer to this as efficiency. This could also be pacing in here as well. Basically, here I'm thinking about how does an athlete develop fluidity of movement? How do they develop smoothness? How can they carry just a minimal amount of tension that's necessary to be able to perform certain reps? So this could be different variations of technique based on workout demands, where it's different variations of barbell cycling, where do I touch my hip in my touch and go snatches, or do I no contact power snatch and no contact muscle snatchers? All these different variations that we can play with. Am I going to be doing sort of a toes to bar where I'm hinging and doing more of a pike? Am I going to do it where I'm keeping the toes in close and sort of have a swinging, scooping action at the bottom? There's so many different variations that we can play with in terms of technique. Is your technique sustainable and you can endure for a long period of time? Can you make that a sprint variation? All of that goes into the economy layer. So capacity, economy, and then the top is execution. Again, these are these tier 2 game day skills that are only going to be able to be layered if someone has the other 2 layers, right? You can't put a peak onto, this tiny little base. It's never going to work. It's never going to support that. they're always going to get their attention pulled back down and their focus pulled back down into the immediate things that they're actually going on in the moment when they're competing, because they just don't have the capacity that's required, and they don't have the actual movements developed to the point where they can stay fluid and natural and smooth throughout that either. So let's move on. 5 ways how you can embrace your inner competitor. Here, I'm mainly referring to in-person competitions because I really think this is really where the art of competing comes into play, especially. I'm thinking like local comps, maybe a semifinal where it's an in-person semifinal. It's a sanctioned event where you're actually traveling somewhere to do the competition. Certainly the games would play into this, right? Again, a lot of these things can apply to a qualifier where you're doing it in your home gym environment, but I think they're applied a little bit less just because it feels more like a training day when you get to set up your gym and kind of go about your normal routine. You don't have to deviate very much from sort of the normal patterns of your life. So again, I'm mainly referring to in-person competitions when I'm kind of running through these. So the first way that you can embrace your inner competitor is reinterpret arousal. We have an athlete, they're 10 minutes out from the competition, like the start. Event 1 is getting ready. These are the symptoms that they're experiencing. My heart rate is elevated. My palms are sweaty, like I have butterflies in my stomach. There's 2 thoughts that could happen. Thought number 1, I'm so nervous. I've been working so hard for this moment. This anxiety is crippling. Or thought number 2, I'm so excited. I've been working so hard for this moment. Let's do this. So the language there is very, very similar, and the symptoms are exactly the same. So again, either way, that middle statement was, I've been working so hard for this moment. And I think that's a really important part of this. Like, someone is going to care about their performance because they spent so much time investing into a particular moment. Like, you've had months of training leading up to a particular moment in time. And this is sort of the culmination of all that hard work. And it's time to see if it's going to actually pay off. There's no way around feeling a little bit amped up and excited for that. And that's certainly not going to be always a bad thing either. It's how you're going to reinterpret those same symptoms. So again, athlete number 1, I'm so nervous. This anxiety is crippling. Versus athlete number 2, I'm so excited. Let's do this, right? Again, the symptoms that they are experiencing are exactly the same. So some people are allowing those emotions to basically overtake them with negative thoughts or negative self-talk. And other people are going to take those same set of emotions or those same physiological symptoms and be able to turn those into enabling their best performance and kind of change that into positive self-talk and to be able to motivate them and actually basically be able to allow them to express higher levels of fitness that they ever could in just like a normal regular training day. So Matthias Steiner is an incredible example of this, the guy I was talking about in the beginning. Basically, he was harnessing the power of emotion, the energy of the crowd. He was talking about like the hum of the excitement, how you could feel that, and that's why he doesn't listen to music and things like that. And basically just like seizing a moment, right? Like those quotes are so incredibly powerful, especially knowing what he went through as just a human being, losing his wife. Yeah, it's definitely one of the most incredible moments that I didn't witness it. I've watched it on video. I actually linked to the video in the show notes. It's an incredible video. If you have not seen that yet, check it out. Show notes, zorfitness.com/podcast/061. And then the second way which you can embrace your inner competitor is reframe fatigue. So we have that same athlete, and now they're not 10 minutes out from their competition. They're actually in event 1. They're in the middle of event 1, and it's some 5 rounds for time, high power output movements. They're feeling really fatigued. They're in like round 4 out of 5. Okay, that's the moment. We've all been there at some point. There's really one thought that's going to occur either way, and then once again, there's a fork in the road about how you can think. Thought number 1 is, I'm feeling tired. So athlete number 1, or option number 1 maybe. I'm feeling tired. This really hurts. I'm going to fall behind. Basically like, man, I'm really hurting. I can't sustain this. I'm going to drop off. Or option number 2 as a thought, I'm feeling tired. This really hurts. They must also be really tired. Time to put the pressure on them and make them hurt. Again, it's the exact same set of physiological symptoms that are going to cause that same initial thought. There's no denying the fatigue that's coming up. is reframing it of, man, this really stinks for me versus, man, I'm hurting, so they have to be hurting, right? And I'm going to put the pressure on them and make them hurt. So it's reframing that fatigue. I've heard it said before, you're going to have to bleed if you want to beat me. And in CrossFit, that's a figure of speech. Maybe in another sport like MMA or something that might be actually true. But in our sport, it's just saying like, hey, if you want to beat me, you're going to have to put yourself into the hurt locker. So I remember this one time I was doing a local run, bike, run competition. And this was like my later years of college where I was kind of doing this in the off season for wrestling, where I was starting to get into competitive triathlon. But it certainly wasn't something that I was like really prepping for, like really taking super seriously. I'm just a really competitive person, so I like to win. But anyway, it was like a 5K, 40K, 5K. And I remember getting off the bike, and the guy in first was like a semi-pro guy. He was way out in front. But there was another guy who got off the bike maybe 2 minutes before me. He was like 200 meters out in front when I started on the run. And he was in my vision, so I could actually see him. And, you know, the first portion of the run, I really couldn't like work that hard because I like was kind of getting crampy in my calves and my hamstrings. So for anyone who's like an endurance athlete or, you know, just an athlete in general, if you've ever had that sort of cramp come on, you know, there's no real like pushing through it. Like if you try to go hard, you're going to completely like get into a tonic cramp and not be able to move at all. So I kind of like was, you know, running a little bit gingerly and kind of like taking my time through that a little bit in the first part of the run. And then by, you know, maybe 30 to 40% after I was sort of out of that transition phase, I was starting to feel good. So I opened up my pace quite a bit. And this was an out and back, mind you. So what that means, it stinks to actually do out and backs because they're basically the worst because you run the same course. And it was a run, bike, run. So literally ran the same way 4 times. Anyway, so yeah, basically what that means is you're going to have to pass the other guy and you're going to see him in his face when you go to turn around. And, you know, at that point, we are still probably 150 meters apart. So, you know, 75 meters as we get really close to passing each other, I basically look at him and like stare into his eyes and basically like looked into his soul and was like, I'm coming for you. So now we're closing in on the finish. This is the last like 2K of this race. And I remember seeing this guy in front of me and visualizing something that I had done when I was a little kid. Growing up, I would go over to my friend's house and they had a pool and they put a little basketball hoop on the side of their pool. And I remember playing this basketball game for hours. And this is, mind you, the only type of basketball I like because it's basically like wrestle your opponent, try to rip the ball out of their hands and then just dunk it on this tiny net. So inevitably, the ball goes into the deep end. And when it goes into the deep end, the two people go over but they both grab it. And basically what happens is they both end up sinking to the bottom. And someone is like out of breath, so they have to return to the surface and the other person gets the ball. So I kind of recognized this. And what I started doing is anytime it would go over to the deep end, I would just get over there, like bear hug the ball. And when the other person tries to rip it out of my hands, we sink to the bottom. And then I'm just chilling there waiting for them to get out of breath. When they get out of breath, they have to return to the surface. And then I'm left with the ball. So that's what I was actually visualizing the last 2K of that run. I was just imagining like bear hugging my opponent, falling into water and just like sinking to the bottom of like this dark lake and just both of us just like suffocating there and being like, I am willing to endure this voluntary pain and hold myself in this state longer than you are willing to do that. I did pass the guy with 400 meters left before the finish. The point is, when you're competing, if you are able to tie in a strong emotional, just like a visceral component, you're going to be able and so much more willing to dig so much deeper. So let's take a look at 2 athletes here. Another example. Both of these athletes are identical in their metrics, right? So their physiological capacity is exactly the same. So both athletes can row a 2K in 7 minutes. Both can clean and jerk 295 pounds, and both can do 12 unbroken ring muscle ups in a max set. Right, so let's just assume that all their physiological metrics are exactly the same. We have athlete A. He views himself as a recreational competitor. He signed up for this competition because his buddy was joining the intermediate division. He occasionally goes out with his friends on Friday night and ends up kind of missing out on Saturday workouts sometimes as a result. His wife thinks competitive fitness is a waste of time that pulls him away from his family. Athlete B. He views himself as a serious competitor. He has mapped out his season months ago and strategically signed up for this comp as the kickoff to his competitive season. He remembers every early morning where he could have slept in, but didn't. His wife and his kids are his biggest fans, and they're on the sideline over there cheering him on. Who do you think is going to win? And the third way of how you can embrace your inner competitor is stay composed. So above all, a savvy competitor doesn't lose their cool. So, emotionality has its place, like I described before. Racing and playing head games has its place. But so does just being smart. And, if it's a workout that you don't really know your capacity, just make sure that you stay in your lane and keep your focus right there. And sometimes it just means cutting your losses, right? Basically, the goal in the current scoring system is to maximize your points, not your effort, right? So as to get the best possible placing with the least possible amount of energy expenditure, right? And that's how you can maximize your performance across the weekend, and hopefully end up at the best spot on the leaderboard, which is the ultimate goal of competing. One example of this is from the 2021 Rogue Invitational. It's the Bella Complex. It's a clean and a jerk, plus a front squat, plus a jerk for max load. So Guy Maleros hit 367 on his second of 3 attempts. And you could see him after that attempt, and as everybody else is going back around for their third attempt, and it was every 30 seconds the next athlete would go, he was kind of eyeing up everybody's bars and seeing what they were putting on. And it was basically going all the way across the front row with all the athletes attempting their final lifts. And when it got to Guy, he just waved at the crowd, right? He had no reason to complete a third lift because no one was going to attempt more than he made, right? So there was zero reason for him to do that. He already had gotten the maximal number of points. So there's no need for him to waste any more of his effort on that event. He had already maximized his points. Another example of this comes from the 2016 CrossFit Games, event number 2, the deadlift ladder. So no one even came close to Brooke Wells in this event. She smashed it. She was the only one who cleared the ladder. 415 pounds was that final bar. Only one to lift that. The funny thing is she placed 37 out of the 40, the field of 40, in the event that immediately preceded that. That was the trail run. I think it was a 7K trail run. But basically in that event, at the end of the event, or the last few minutes of that event, 38th place was far enough behind here where she knew that she wasn't going to get caught by that person. And 36th place was far enough ahead where she knew that even if she really kind of dug and went for it, that she wasn't going to be able to get that person. So she just sort of strolled into the finish line. There was no real reason to push really hard because either way, she was going to get the points that she was going to get. The funny thing is the exact same thing happened on the men's side. So Sam Dancer, he strolls in dead last on the trail run. No one was even close to him. And again, he has no reason to push at that point, right? Because either way, they're not going to start the next event until you're done. So you might as well just kind of take your time. So he basically walks across the finish line and has enough time to basically stroll over to the first bar of the deadlift ladder and lift it up. He also was the only one to clear that bar at 615 pounds. So in practice, maximizing your performance means getting the best scores, the best times, the best loads that you possibly can. In competition, maximizing your performance means getting the best place that you possibly can. And that also means that while you get that best place, if you can do that while using less energy, you're only going to be better off for it. The fourth way that you can embrace your inner competitor is race tactics. First thing I'll say here is know when to race and know when not to race. So you can't race without the supporting fitness. So for example, Sam Dancer could not go out and race the trail run and try to compete with all the other guys because he didn't have the underlying physiology to support that sort of performance. Again, someone who can clean and jerk 315 pounds can't play head games with a person who can clean and jerk 385, right? They're never going to be able to do the back and forth thing that the very best of the best can do because they don't have the capacity to support it. So again, the base of the pyramid has to be there. You have to have the underlying capacity. And in certain workouts, you have to pace that correctly. So you have to make sure that you keep the economy portion of there in there. So again, unless you keep the two other portions of that pyramid, you're never going to be able to actually do things like race tactics to take advantage of that. So again, you can only race if you have the engine to do so and you know how to keep the car on the track. It's the basics of this. So I'll also say that race tactics is different from pacing, although certainly pacing can play an important role in your overall of your race tactics. In the 2004 film National Treasure, which by the way is one of my dad's favorite movies, Nicolas Cage plays this historian, treasure hunter type. And, of course, there's a bunch of bad guys who are trying to beat him to the punch. But anyway, in this one scene, Cage is walking down the sidewalk and he notices that two of these bad guys are following him kind of off in the distance and closing a little bit. And he notices, but he keeps his composure. He doesn't show that he knows that they're there and just kind of continues strolling. And he crosses the sidewalk right as this bus, the city bus, is rolling by. So their view of him gets blocked for just 4 or 5 seconds as this bus rolls across. And as the tail of the bus kind of comes out of the view of the bad guys, they expect him to be right there walking at the same pace. He's 50 meters down the road sprinting, and it catches them completely off guard. It's a really cool scene. The point is, athletes can use those same types of tactics in racing. So I realize that you might not be able to hide behind the rig in a CrossFit competition, but there are times where this sort of thing comes into play in sports. For example, in cross country, if you have somebody and they go around a blind corner and they just had someone who was kind of tailing them the whole time, where they're a few, kind of following a few meters behind and they just couldn't shake them the entire race. If they can get around a corner and take off at a really hard effort, the person, by the time they get around there and see them in their visual field, they're further away and they sort of broke that mental tow rope and they can take off and that person's sort of left behind. So again, there are actually times where things like this come into play. The same thing, I would say, the same type of thing is true if you're someone who's, maybe in a run or a ruck, maybe a paddle or a kayak, certainly biking. All of these tactics apply where if you go to pass someone, you want to pass them fast, right? You don't want to kind of go by them slowly where they can kind of get in behind you and kind of follow your wake and you can sort of break their wind for them. Rather, you want to pass them with speed. Even if it makes you hurt worse, you want to pass them with speed so that they go, oh man, I'm just going to let them go, right? You don't want someone to be able to psychologically feel like they have a chance to stick with you. Again, this is saying that if you have the capacity to do it, you're not going to pass someone if you don't have the capacity to do it. So again, it's important that we have the underlying engine and the physiological systems that are necessary. But once you have that, that's when you can start to race and take advantage of some of these race tactics. Another example, 2018 CrossFit Games Event 1 was crit. This is 10 laps of cycling around the venue, basically, in Madison. And it was probably about 12K total. So let me start by saying, as an extra athlete, I've probably watched, Tour de France, or at least followed it a little bit every year since middle school or high school. So I can confidently say that the only thing more painful than the commentary of this event was watching the athletes who had no business handling a road bike, let alone in a tight group, around turns, avoiding potholes, and in clips, right? It was disastrous. In my mind, this event was more about knowing how to position yourself than it was about output, or raw wattage. So basically, you cannot put yourself in the middle or back half of that race because inevitably, if you're in the pack and someone goes down in front of you, you're at the mercy of what happens, what everyone else around you is doing. They're going to steer into you, or you're going to be kind of corridored in, you're just going to plow over somebody in front of you and crash, right? So you have to be in the front half of that race. However, you do not want to be leading and breaking wind. There have been multiple studies done that show that, there's anywhere from a 27 to 50% drag reduction for drafting. And again, that depends on a lot of factors, like how close are you to the person in front of you, how many people are in front of you, how fast are you going, how big's the group, all those sorts of factors. So in an event like that, you have to say, okay, the first, 3, 4, 5 laps of that race out of the 10 laps, regardless of how I feel, which is a very big caveat, I'm going to make sure that I'm sitting somewhere between second and maybe 6th and 8th place in that race, regardless of what happens. I'm going to get on that person's wheel. I'm going to stay there. I'm going to stay out of trouble that's behind that, right? And that's the only way that you're going to be able to attack an event like that. These are the sorts of things that we're talking about for race tactics. And then the fifth and final way that you can embrace your inner competitor is with head games. So as many people know, I was a health and physical education teacher. And in my health class, the first unit that we went over was relationships. So here we went over a lot of the typical stuff that people would think of, like, abusive relationships, how to identify and get help if you need it for domestic violence, things like that. But then also we talked about healthy relationships. As part of healthy relationships, we talked about communication. And as communication, we talked about nonverbal communication. And in that lesson, I showed a documentary called The Secrets of Body Language, which was sort of this retro, old school type documentary. And it was super interesting. And since I played this for each class and I got to see it basically multiple times, and they kind of broke down how you can tell if someone's like in a position of power in a room, how you can tell based on their gestures, their facial expressions, the way that they're standing and their posture, how they're feeling in a given moment, and that you can exploit that and use it to your advantage. It was extremely interesting, and they kind of did it from both perspectives of saying like, okay, this is how you could potentially read other people, but this is also how you can learn to control your own body language and use it to your advantage. Basically, body language is gestures, facial expressions, body positions, posture. Basically, you can learn to read a person and what they're thinking or feeling if you pay attention to it. So how does this apply to competing? I would say someone who's a savvy competitor, they can read their opponents, right? They can see what's going on, and based on what they see, they can make strategic moves. But then you get to decide what vibes you're putting out. You basically get to choose what nonverbals are you going to show. And you get to kind of, hold your cards a little bit closer to your chest and be a little bit more tactile and start to play these head games a little bit more. In certain sports, I think this plays more of a role than others. Certainly in a lot of combat sports, this is a really big part of the sport, just because of the physicality of the nature of it, but also just because you're up in each other's face, where that's not necessarily the case in CrossFit. In wrestling, this is obviously a big part of, how I think about trying to wear down an opponent. You want to do this sort of physically and mentally. Like physically, you're coming at them, you got heavy hands, you're trying to tire them out where, their back's tired. And when they're tired, they're not going to move their feet as quick, so they're more susceptible to your attacks, things like that. But mentally, this is also true. In between breaks, like between periods or like just breaks in the actions when you're turning back to the center, you're going to do everything that you can to just show that you're confident, that you're not tired, that you can basically handle this, and that you're not really, they're not a concern to you almost, in a sense. This would be both positive and negative. Sometimes you get opponents who are like over there and they're kind of hands on knees, kind of hunched over, or they're kind of stalling, getting back to the middle of the ring. And that's when people would start to build momentum, at least mentally, where you start to break the person. You can actually feel them when they, you're really weighing on them, and both like physically and mentally, you can almost like feel and sense the air kind of leave them, and that you've kind of broken them mentally. And that's a huge part of the sport, and I think it's underappreciated in non-contact sports. But in CrossFit, obviously you can't like wear somebody down physically and like stand in front of their bar or something like that. But there's still a lot of head games that you can play. 2 examples. The first one is the 2021 CrossFit Games Event 6. So this is the clean ladder with the running between where they went out of the arena. Athletes had to run around these like stack of pylons. Basically, they made like a wall out of these like tackle dummies, and you had to run around them. But they were like the kind where if you like hit them, they'd kind of like wobble back and forth, but ultimately stand back up. Brett Fikowski, every single lap, he was made sure that he was basically right in front of like this little pack that was behind him of guys. And he would do this really subtly, but he would cut in close to it each time and just kind of elbow it a little bit as he ran past, enough where it kind of went forward out of his way, but then it would come back the opposite direction and basically be coming into the guys who are running around that corner, wanting to cut it really tight, so that they either had to basically shove this weeble wobble out of the way, or they had to run like several feet out and around it, right? It's just like a little thing. It wasn't like out of the rules, right? There was no like rules around that. And it wasn't like he was obviously shoving it to try to get it to come back to them. He just subtly elbowed it, but it was every single time, and you could tell he was doing it on purpose. And it was just an annoyance for everyone behind him. And if nothing else, it took their focus away from, the running and the cleans to this is really annoying that this thing's in my way. So again, it's as simple as that. It's totally legal. It's totally within the rules, but it's also a big convenience to his other competitors. Our second example comes from the 2021 CrossFit Games Event 3. This was that 550-yard sprint. For those of you who weren't in person and couldn't really see it on TV, you couldn't really see it as well. But basically, there's like this pretty aggressive turn before like the last maybe 60 or 80 yards then to the finish. And you were at a huge disadvantage if you were on the outside as you kind of approach that turn. Because basically, there's a reason why tracks have a staggered start. You have to run further if you're on the outside. So for the one heat of males, Vellner was kind of getting caught on the outside, and he basically like shoved his way past Guy as they were kind of going around the corner and sort of cut him off to the point where I think Guy tripped actually, and then he kind of went by him. And I actually heard Vellner like comment on that, and he was like, yeah, I totally cut him off. But again, like race officials did nothing about it. And it was maybe not really within the rules, but they didn't punish him either. So again, that kind of stuff, there's going to be a natural amount of contact in an event where you're running with the other people. And it's like a certain amount of that is going to be acceptable and necessary for you to express and actually, again, potentially race, but also get in people's heads about that kind of thing. Our last example comes from the 2019 CrossFit Games finale. So this is the final event here. It was the standard. So 30 clean and jerks, 30 ring muscle ups, 30 snatches. It's 135.95 as the weight. So despite Noah Ohlsen getting off the rings first, and he probably did 2 singles at his snatch bar before Frazier got to his snatch bar. So like, you know, he sort of would have had that momentum going for him. It's like, oh yeah, like Ohlsen got to the bar first, like he's looking good, like that sort of thing. Frazier, in his first rep, he snatches it up, and instead of dropping the bar, he lowers it immediately and does a couple touch and go reps. And the crowd, you could just hear the crowd like erupt as he decides to touch and go, and like everybody's going nuts. And you can just like imagine the inevitability that would almost feel in both athletes' minds, both like Frazier and Ohlsen, right? So like Frazier, it's like literally you have so much adrenaline because the entire crowd just is like going nuts because you're doing these reps. And for Ohlsen, it's like, I am up like ahead, but this guy is like right on my heels and the crowd is just going nuts. And it feels like he's inevitably going to catch me. Like he's a reigning champ. There's all these things that are kind of probably going through his mind, at least his subconscious. So I think this is a great example of like, this is not Frazier's optimal pacing strategy. Like if he was doing this in his garage by himself, he would not be doing touch and go snatches at the end. That's just not how you're going to get your best score. However, in an environment like this, when there's a crowd, there's other factors that are in play, right? He can leverage the fact that there's a crowd to help him do better and to basically help, you know, fuel him to his best performance. And, you know, there's sort of an X factor that's in that environment during that time. And Frazier's the one who could take advantage of that. And that's huge in terms of like headspace, mentally what's going on. And again, you can only race in this and make these sorts of, you know, moment by moment decisions if you have the underlying physiology to support it. He has the strength, he has the capacity so that he gets to make these types of calls and gets to play those types of head games. The last thing that I'll add is oftentimes the best way to get into an opponent's head is not with trash talk. It's simply by convincing them that you're comfortable. There's so much to developing a competitive mindset and learning how to compete at your best, but I hope today was a fresh take on how to go about developing the art of competing. Hey, it's Ben again. Thanks for listening today. To be completely honest, it's been really rewarding to have people who listen to the show regularly reach out to me, whether they have a question about training or just to say hey. So if you haven't done that yet, do it. I'm pretty good about getting back to people, and you can feel free to email me, ben@zorfitness.com, or message me on Instagram @zorfitness. And graciously, I've had some people reach out to me and ask how they can support the show. Number one way that you can support the show if you are a regular listener is just by rating the show. Most apps have a platform where you can actually rate it, and on Apple Podcasts, you can write a review as well. This is super helpful in having other coaches and athletes find the podcast, but also just having it grow and for me to continue to want to put out more and more content. Also, I'm going to be posting more full episodes of the fitness movement to our YouTube channel. So if you're someone who actually enjoys seeing my face when I talk, you can head over to YouTube and subscribe if you please. And if you're someone who is watching on YouTube, you have the ability to like our videos, but then you can also comment on the video if you have questions about the episode or if you want to suggest a topic for a future episode. And lastly, if you're someone who really does value what we're putting out, I would encourage you to hire a coach. For me, coaching is the bulk of my job, and it's what I believe I do best. So if you're an athlete or a coach looking to up your fitness game, be sure to reach out. You can message me on Instagram @ZorFitness or email me ben@zorfitness.com. Thanks again for listening today, and as always, stay the course.